Does your wife upset you? Does she often do things that get under your skin? And how do you respond? Do you respond with frustration or anger or anything of that sort? Or do you respond with a loving, graceful embrace? Today, we're going to unpack the importance of being a graceful husband and how we respond to our wife in situations that typically can frustrate us or upset us. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Husband's Coach's Corner, the podcast that teaches husbands how to love their wife every day and become better men in the process. I'm your host, Chris Scott, aka the Husband Coach. Hey, what's up, and welcome back to another episode of the Husband Coach's Corner. Today is part 3 of a 4-part series where we're unpacking 4 attributes to show love to our wife in our marriage. So far, we've talked about being self-giving and being approachable. Next week, we are going to talk about being mindful in the marriage. But this week, we're going to unpack the importance of showing grace in our marriage. Now, before we dive too deep into the content, I do want to make you aware of marriagedrills.com. The link is in the description box below. And by going to this website, you'll be able to provide any podcast episode input. You'll also be able to keep up with me. And if you are interested in going into a one-on-one coaching session, I do offer those. You can sign up for those on the website. If you are looking for a way of getting deeper in building your marriage and you need someone to come alongside you one-on-one, then this is something for you. All right. You can sign up for it on the website and I will get back to you and we'll work out a date and time and go from there. Now, talking about being a graceful husband. This is going to be a very unique episode because if you look up the word grace, if you just Google it, there are a lot of definitions and none really touch on the base of grace that I'm representing in this episode. And mind you, this is a Christian perspective of giving grace, which the definition that we use around the church or internal to the church is to give something that isn't deserved. In the context of marriage, we can do this so easily on a ton of different levels. We're going to unpack those a little bit further. But what I really want to help you understand is this is not being merciful, because that has something to deal more with being compassionate and forgiving in a circumstance in which you have the authority to punish. Now, understanding that we don't punish our wives, right? We should never have the mindset of I'm punishing my wife. We instead respond to our wives. And my prayer for everyone listening and husbands that are growing is that you are responding with love. Now, how do we respond with love? Well, these 4 attributes are the ways, some of the ways in which we can respond in love. So that's why we're talking about grace today. And it is something that is not easy, just like the other 3 attributes that we're going to cover. But this is something that we should really, really implement into our marriage and into our relationship with our wife. So, very simply put, here's the definition that I'm going to offer up to you guys for this particular, for the word grace, and just have this in mind as we unpack this throughout the episode. So the definition is the decision to be patient with your wife when she does something that wrongs you in some way. All right. This is a decision to be patient with your wife when she does something that wrongs you or upsets you. That's what we're talking about when we say give grace. All right. So why is it important to give your wife grace? You know, this is something that I have had many men, they struggle with this for a lot of different reasons. They don't understand the importance. So that's why I want to come off with the importance immediately so you can see why this is something you really want to do if you can't like imagine why. Okay. So the first one is it builds trust in your marriage. We've talked about trust and building that in the marriage for on a lot of different episodes. And here again, we're seeing how building trust is so important. And the way that you build trust is through giving your wife grace. Like, just think about it. Your wife does something and she knows you typically respond in an angered manner or frustrated manner. But instead of you responding in that way, you're responding to her with patience and and a level of kindness and gentleness. How much more do you think your wife is going to be willing to come and talk to you about the things like when something really crazy is happening? Like being graceful in your marriage is probably one of the best ways of getting proactive interaction with your wife so you guys can overcome some challenges or issues that you may be facing in your marriage. All right. Now, the second one, I already covered it. She brings you the issues that you are having or that she's having. So when you are being graceful, you will hear more about what's happening in your wife's life and tying this in with being mindful, which we'll talk about next week. When you talk about, or when you tie those two things together, being self giving, it works with your approachability. And the way that you become more approachable is by being graceful. And when you are giving grace and she's approaching you, you have an opportunity to really pour into your wife in a way that no one else does, period. And if someone else is pouring into your wife in the way that is reserved specifically for you, you got a problem and it's time to solve that problem. All right. Don't let it keep festering and growing and going out of control. Now, when you choose grace and it's visible in your marriage, your wife sees your love. She feels it and she sees it. It's it's almost impossible for your wife not to recognize when you are giving her grace. The reason for that is she knows when she did something that wronged you, and you don't have to point it out, right? You don't have to be like, see, this is that thing that I told you about, and this is exactly how it's happening. No, you don't have to do that because when something doesn't go the way that it was expected to go and you get a unplanned result, right? Then your wife already knows that by you jumping on your bandwagon or your high horse or soapbox, whatever analogy you want to use, by you doing that, you're actually driving a wedge between the relationship of you and your wife. So when you're being graceful, you are removing that stressful circumstance. And it's not to say that the problem is going to just disappear because that's not true. That's not how this works. And that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to get you to do is to be on one accord with your wife when there is a challenge or a situation that comes up. And that's why it's so important to be graceful. And the next thing is it inspires her to do the same. See, I've said this many times. We as husbands, we have to be the leaders in the marriage. We can't be sitting in the back of the marriage and just hoping that it's going to work out. We actually have to be the ones implementing and moving forward towards the end vision of whatever you guys agreed on as your vision for your marriage. If you don't have that vision, that'll be an episode later on because it's important that both of you know where you're going in marriage. Like, what is a successful marriage? How do you define a successful marriage? But once you guys have had that conversation, it is your responsibility to make sure that that happens. It's not your wife's responsibility. You have to be the leader. You have to go take charge, move forward, and your wife will follow. But if you're not putting in the effort, she's not going to put in the effort. And if she's putting in the effort before you're putting in the effort, you are going to be in for a very, very rude awakening uh, later on in your marriage if you don't figure this out now and figure out how to be graceful. And bottom line, learn to lead in your marriage. Now, I'm going to give this disclaimer up front. Many men, they look at this as, well, I don't if I don't exercise my manly authority over my wife when I have the opportunity to, it makes me look weak and I won't be respected. Now, if you guys are familiar with the book Love and Respect by Dr. Egg Riches, I think it's Emerson Egg Riches. I recommend that book. We as men, we want to be respected. And as soon as we lose a level of respect, we start to stonewall or remove things from our intimacy capabilities and things of that sort. Moral of the story, being graceful is not about losing respect. It's actually about you choosing to show love to your wife, who will then reciprocate that love that you showed her in respect. It sounds like it doesn't work, but guys, if there is anything that you take away from this message, is that you have to implement this attribute into your marriage today. And I'm going to give you some ways of doing that, but you have to walk away from this message knowing I have to be graceful to my wife in our marriage today. And then you wake up tomorrow and you do the same thing. Make it a mantra. How can I be graceful to my wife today? Right? The tagline of this show is find a way to love your wife every day. I would even replace the word love with find a way to be graceful to my wife today. And you can apply that to all of the other attributes that I'm talking about, right? Find a way to be approachable for my wife today. Find a way to be self-giving to my wife today. Find a way to be mindful to my wife today. Like, it works. That is the reason why we're talking about it, because this is the foundation of really building a long, strong, lasting life with your wife, period. All right. So, what does giving grace really look like in marriage? You know, it's going to look different for every single person. So I'm going to stick to some very generic and cookie cutter examples here. Your life and your marriage is going to be your life and your marriage. So figure this out for yourself. Do some deep thinking and figure this out for yourself. But maybe you get upset if your wife doesn't cook dinner. Maybe you get upset if your wife spends way too much money. Maybe you get upset if your wife was supposed to pay a bill and she didn't. Maybe your wife lost or destroyed something that was extremely important to you. Again, this doesn't fit every scenario, but I think everyone can imagine how that would be upsetting to someone and how you would feel wronged. And this ties back to that definition. It is in these exact moments that grace is so important for you to show to your wife, because it's these moments that define that trust and confidence in your relationship for your wife to come back to you and to say, hey, I messed something up, and feel comfortable with what she's doing. All right. We don't want our wives walking on eggshells. We don't want them tiptoeing around us, because that goes back to that approachability thing. If we're not approachable, our wives won't bring us the things that we really need to know about. And then we'll be like, well, why didn't you tell me about this? And now we're upset, but we're to blame for that. So this is the reason why we have to be graceful. We have to make it welcoming for our wife to come to us to tell us these things. Now, you can respond in anger if you so choose. You're a grown man. You can if you want to. However, I'll recommend that you instead respond with love and with grace when these things happen. And you can respond in one of two ways. The first one is, hey, you know what, honey, don't worry about it. That's not a big deal. Now, I got to caution you, don't say it's not a big deal if it really is a big deal to you. The goal is not to lie to your wife to make her feel better. All right. That's not what we're doing. That is not what I want anyone to walk away hearing. If you're a wife listening to this episode, and you're like, see, Chris is telling you to say it's no big deal, so I don't have to feel bad when I do something. No, that's not what I'm getting at. All right. If it's no big deal, if it really isn't a big deal, then you should let your wife know that. But it's got to be the truth and it's got to be genuine. Don't just say it because you're trying to make peace. Because if it is a big deal, then my second response that I would offer to you is to say, this thing bothers me, but we're going to work through it together to figure out the way forward. Instead of yelling at her, you just have to let her know, like, hey, this is not okay, but I love you. And this is not going to tear us apart or drive a wedge between us because you forgot to pay the bill, right? I'm not talking about infidelity things because those types of issues, yes, grace does work in those situations, but the follow on is so much greater. And in those types of situations, the response is a little bit different. I'm talking about little ankle biter things and things that are not infidelity related, right? That's why I gave those cookie cutter incidents. But you guys, hopefully that's making sense to you. You want to respond with, yes, this does bother me, and I'm not okay with the way that this turned out or what you did. However, I love you, and I'm going to we're going to figure out how we move forward from here. But I want you to know that I love you, and we are going to make it through this, right? Because now you're giving your wife the path forward. Again, you're being that leader, and this is why this is so important. You're leading through the hardship, you're leading through the conflict, you're leading through the struggle. That's your role as the husband. You have to own that responsibility. Do not let your wife own that responsibility. She can absolutely partner with you. And this isn't me saying like wives are inferior or anything like that. No. What I'm saying is, if you don't own that responsibility, she will not have the level of respect that you are expecting her to give you. Okay? That's just the way it is. You have to step up and be the man, and you have to lead. All right? Period. That's all there is to it. Now, how can you learn to implement this into your marriage today? Well, you got to change your mindset. All right. Everything starts in your mind when it comes down to making a decision, right? Whenever you decide to do something, it first starts as a thought in your mind. So how are you thinking about the situation that you are presented with whenever you're dealing with this challenge with your wife? That's the very first thing that you got to do. You got to say, okay, how am I thinking about this? Am I thinking about it the right way? If the answer to that is yes, then okay, you're already on the right path. You got the right mindset. But now go a little bit further and look for ways to show her grace on small things. All right. So maybe you guys have a place where keys go in your house, and your wife left the keys sitting on the counter instead of putting them onto the key rack or something like that. Instead of going to your wife and scolding her, hey, you left the keys on the counter again or whatever, you never put the keys on, like, the way you respond to your wife is the big deal here, right? because you can address something in love and respond with grace and still address the situation at hand. Here's the scenario: your wife leaves the keys on the counter. You can walk up to her and be like, hey, you forgot to put the keys on the key rack. You got to stop doing that. All right. That's one way. That's responding out of frustration. The second way is, hey, honey, I noticed that the keys were sitting on the counter again. I went ahead and put them on the key rack, but in the future, can you make sure that they get onto the key rack? I think everyone can realize the two differences in those responses. One is pointing the fingers, saying, hey, you're all messed up. The second one, you are being an interactive part. Because if you noticed, I said I already put them on the key rack. So I took the burden of her saying, thinking to herself, like, oh, I got to go do something. He's trying to tell me to go do something. And it gives her the opportunity to really hear what it is that you're saying. All right. Especially if it's something like that minor. Find the way, or find small things where you can just be graceful to your wife. Just do it. It's not, it really doesn't cost you anything. And in most of the situations that I'm talking about, no one's going to ever know except for you and your wife. And if this is you paying into the so-called respect bank, if that's what you want to call it, I don't know what else, what anyone may call it. Send me a message if you want to tell me what you would call this particular thing. But moral of the story, when you do these small things, it builds that trust and confidence, and it builds her love for you, which then reciprocates into respect for you. All right. So there's the first one. Look for ways to show your wife grace in the small things that happen every single day. All right. That's your mission. You're going to look for a small thing every day and then show her grace with it. The second one is practice giving grace to your kids and your friends if that's applicable, right? Giving grace is not just something that we have to be good at in marriage. If you are a father, you should be good at giving grace to your kids. You should be really good at giving grace to your kids. If you are a supervisor at work, you should give grace to your employees. Again, not taking away the problem and saying like, hey, I'm undermining, or I'm going to reduce the problem to it's nothing. But the way that you go about addressing it, this will make you a great leader when you are at the workforce or whatever it may be. I implement this all the time in my office. I'm the chief of HR. That's my job. And I have a few people that they work for me, and I give them grace more than I can even imagine. Because truthfully, it's warranted and it's not necessary for me to get upset with them. So, and what that helps me with is when I come home, you would think like, oh, well, Chris, you gave all your grace out at the out at the office today. You can't give grace now that you're at the house. That's not true. I can give grace because it's a mindset, and I'm looking for areas to give grace. And so I do, right? And man, look, you got to try it. Okay. I can't do it justice by just giving you my words and my situations. When you actually go and give your wife grace and you show her this grace and you love her in this way, it's going to build your relationship. And when you learn to practice this outside of your marriage in areas where it is beneficial, you're going to see like just the way that it changes your character and your ability to perform in and out of your marriage, period. The people will gravitate towards you, and they want to be around you as opposed to running away from you. All right. Now, give grace to your wife. This it can be learned. All right. You do not have to be born with this. Like, I was not born a graceful husband. There is no graceful husband, right? You just show up and you learn how to give your wife grace because you learn your wife and you learn the things that she reciprocates love, and then you just find a way to give her that, period. So the next step that you're going to do in this exercise is you're going to think back to the last time that you and your wife had an argument. All right. We're always going back to arguments, but the point here is when you think of this argument, I want you to think about how you responded to your wife. Did you respond to her with grace, or did you respond to her with anger? All right. If you responded to her with grace, what you have to ask yourself is, how much more grace could I have given in that situation? And how does that apply to other issues where I maybe did not respond to my wife with grace? Now, if you can't think back to an argument where you've ever responded to your wife with grace, or you know for a fact that the argument that you're choosing to reflect on and analyze, you did not respond with grace, and instead you responded with anger and frustration, ask yourself, why did you respond with anger and frustration? And how could I have responded to my wife in a more graceful way? How could I have shown my wife love instead of showing her anger? That's what you have to ask yourself. Then, what I want you to do is take your response of and you could start a sentence of, I could show my wife more grace in, and then you fill in the blank and write out, a sentence however you want to do that, right? And then you go to your wife and you say, hey, honey, the last time we had this argument, I realized that this is what happened. I could have shown you more grace in this situation, or by doing dot, 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 follow, you fill in the blank of whatever it is. Your wife is going to think you lost your mind. Now, if you have been applying the things that I've taught and that I continue to teach, then maybe she won't think that you lost your mind. Maybe she'll be like, you know what? This is just another way that my wife is, or I'm sorry, that my husband is showing that he loves me, right? Maybe that's what she'll take it as. But either way, it doesn't, if you do it, it doesn't really matter how she takes it, as long as she understands that you are trying to be a more loving husband for her and to her. All right. So just like the previous attributes, this is not going to be one of the easiest things. And it's not going to come natural. You are going to have to put in the effort. It did not come natural to me when I started to be more graceful with my wife. In fact, I was one of those guys that was like, no, if I show my wife all this grace, she's going to abuse me. She's going to take advantage of me. She's going to see me as this weak man, and I will not be seen as this weak man. That's what I used to think. And then I started applying it. And even though it made me feel vulnerable at the time, like, let's just be real, it's going to make you feel vulnerable that you're showing this grace. And your mindset, maybe, because sometimes when I show grace, I can tend to believe that I am more superior to her because look at me, I can do this and not be mad at you. Ha ha ha. That is a very terrible mindset. I rebuke that mindset every time that I get it. Whenever I go into that mindset, I say, God, forgive me. That is not who I am or want to be for my wife, because I want to be a humble husband, a level of humility when it comes to giving grace, right? I don't want to give boastful grace. I want to give humility grace or humble grace. All right. So I want to make sure that I make that clear. You should not be on a high horse when you are graceful to your wife. You should be more humble in the approach to how you give grace, or I'm sorry, you should be humble to the approach in which you give grace to your wife, period. All right. Now, hopefully that resonated with you. And every situation can benefit from grace being given. I've already touched on the fact that uh, this will make you feel a little bit more vulnerable, or in terms of, just squishy, right? You're like, no, I'm supposed to be tough as nails, and now I feel soft like a pillow set. Whatever analogy you want to throw in there. And what may even be worse is there may be another man, another guy who tells you, oh, yeah, nah, you got to tell her how it is, and you just got to represent. Like if you are confiding in someone else and you're like, hey, my wife did this and I don't know how to respond. Um, if that person is giving you guidance that is not telling you to respond in a graceful way, but instead they make fun of you if you decide to respond in a graceful way, one of two things is probably true about that man. The first one is that man's not married, so he has no real appreciation for what it means to love a wife. Or that man is married and does not have a marriage worth modeling after. So I would, in either case, whoever this person is, I would not recommend that you follow their lead, because it is not a weak sign to show your wife love through grace. So until next time, my hope and my prayer for all of you that are listening is that you are graceful towards your wife, and that you find a way to love your wife every day. Peace.